So we are diving into Mark's Passion. Last week we talked about just an overview of the four gospel passions, and so we'll spend the next 4 weeks a deep dive into each one. We're doing Mark first, even though it comes second in the Bible. Mark's gospel is generally agreed to be the first one written, like in the late 60s. And so it is the source material. I think we talked about this last week. It's the source material, or a source, for Matthew and Luke. And so we're going to start with like the OG, and then we'll read the remixes, basically, and see what Matthew and Luke add to it and what that tells us about either what additional stuff they learned or what additional things they're trying to say. And then John will do last, because that's a completely kind of different thing. Questions for anyone that read it ahead of time? Any questions about Mark's in particular before we go? I mean, we can go kind of section by section. I don't know that we'll read the whole thing, but anything you noticed in this or questions you had about it?
It just seems to be more the version you were, at least growing up in the Methodist Church. This is kind of the primary version you were taught.
Yeah. Some of that's because it's the shortest, maybe. Because we do John's Passion, I think it's John's, on Palm Sunday, and that's long. Right? I don't actually preach a sermon on Palm Sunday typically.
Thank you.
You are. Well, because the gospel itself takes 20 minutes. And it's a very dramatic, right? The way we do it, we stand up and play parts and do all of that. It's a longer one when we get to that. Mark's it's like just the facts version, right?
It's been similar.
Yeah.
Mark and Matthew are also very similar.
Sure.
I thought the betrayal by Judas came right after it was kind of weird that it came so quickly right after the lady anoints his head. And so I actually did a little research because I thought, wow, that was abrupt. And what I read was it's like emphasizing the contrast between the kindness and the meanness, and it kind of brought it out in him, and like his final thing, I'm tired of you not being the king of the Jews, and you're just a person that's too nice or something.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, we can start in 14. First, there's the plot, right? So we didn't read, at least in this section, we didn't read the Palm Sunday stuff. The Palm Sunday stuff is what starts Holy Week. And then Jesus does a bunch during Holy Week, right? He does some healings, he does some miracles, he flips over tables, he does all those things. And then that continues to tick off the leaders. And then 14 starts. It was 2 days before the Passover. The chief priest and the scribes were looking for a way to arrest Jesus, for they said, not during the festival, or there may be a riot.
So were they concerned of Jesus causing a riot, or were they concerned about arresting him and that causing the riot?
That's a good question. Maybe some of both, right? Because part of the problem is like there's a ton of people that come to town just for this festival.
This party.
Right? And it's a little bit like Bob was just telling me about a peace march. Actually, how he met you. A peace march that he put on way back when, and how there were instigators that were trying to infiltrate. And so it's a little bit like that, right? Like you said, how many, 1,700 people or something?
No, almost 15,000.
Or 15,000.
Oh,
so
wow.
15,000. And so this, like, there's going to be a ton more people. And like, all it takes is one little match spark to set it off. And so I think they were afraid. Maybe not Jesus specifically, but like, there's a bunch of people there, and they don't want to do anything to tick off any of them. And so it maybe has less to do with Jesus and more to do, we're just trying to keep peace. Let's get this festival over.
Yeah, all the inns are full. Everybody's out in the market buying stuff.
Yeah. So then there's the anointing we read, and we don't always place this like in our minds as part of like the passion, but once the rulers decided, in Mark at least, we're going to kill Jesus, the next thing that happens is this woman does something that alludes to preparing him for burial. And so this is where traditionally we talk about like his burial preparation began. And there's this whole back and forth. You talk about it. You know, Judas is like, why are we doing this? We're wasting this money.
But there's significance. But she only puts the perfume on his feet, correct? Not his
No, his
head.
head.
Both?
His head.
His head.
His head too?
Yeah, his
That
head
was
right
on
here. Poured the perfume on his head. I got it
Okay.
right here.
Okay.
Okay.
14.
Yeah, so Judas has this back and forth. Why is the ointment wasted in this way? It could have been sold, but Jesus rebuked Judas, right? And so it's interesting, Judy. Maybe Judas is a little offended. Maybe he feels called out, or maybe he's just like, this
This
guy's
is the last
crazy.
straw.
Yeah. Or, I mean, we're maybe supposed to get the idea that like he's kind of greedy.
Mhm.
And so maybe he's just, maybe he just
Yeah.
sells Jesus out. Because then we immediately get to Jesus, or Judas agrees to betray Jesus.
Yeah, it's kind of abrupt to me. I, not being used to reading this,
Yeah. Yeah. And so, like this shows that Judas went to the chief priest. So it's not like they just sought him out. And then he's basically like, we're in verse 10 here. Basically like, hey, I'm willing to sell this guy out. How much will you give me?
Yeah, greed. Yeah.
And then we immediately jump into Passover. Passover's begun. So the first day of the Passover, where do you want us to go make? So he sent 2 of his disciples telling him. And this is similar to the story from Palm Sunday, right? If you remember that, Jesus told disciples, hey, go find a guy who's going to give you a donkey. This is a kind of a parallel. He's like, where do we want to have our Passover dinner? And he's like, go find a guy. And he's going to tell you there's a room. So we get up to the room. And then as they're eating, here, the next key thing that happens as they're eating, Jesus said, truly, I tell you, one of you who will betray me, one who is eating with me. They began to be distressed, one after another. This is verse 19. Surely not I. He said to them, it's one of the 12, one who is dipping bread into the bowl with me. For the Son of Man goes as it's written of him. But woe to the one by whom the Son of Man was betrayed. So we have that. So now the disciples are probably all looking at each other suspiciously. Like, Jim, is it going to be? Oh, it's going to be great.
Yeah.
You're sounding great.
I'll point fingers.
So you,
Slightly.
yeah, and so
If
Yeah.
it'd be like what we're reading in the Sermon on the Mount, it'd be the outsider, the scapegoat that you would point to.
yeah. And Judas very quickly in tradition becomes a scapegoat, right? I mean, if you betray people, you're either called a Judas or you're called a Benedict Arnold, right? Well, those are the 2 people that famously, like, they become the Kleenex of traitors, right? That's the brand name.
Was Judas one of the last to become a disciple?
That's an interesting question.
As Jesus accumulated these disciples, I just wonder if.
Actually, his name does not seem to be mentioned until now. Because the earlier chapters, talked about the fishing and all that, but yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, this in Mark, it's Mark 3. Let's see what that says. Yes, it's like first in, first out.
Yeah.
I just wonder if he had been through all of this teaching that Jesus had done
Yeah.
and now decided to betray him, or was he a latecomer?
Oh, it does say and Judas.
That never fully emerged, yeah.
Yeah, and so this, Jesus had called some people already by Mark 3, right? He calls his first disciples, that's Simon and his brother Andrew. Then he calls Levi, Matthew, and then does a little bit more. And then in 3, he went up on the mountain and called to him those whom he wanted and came to him. He appointed 12 to be with him, sent them out to preach, to have authority. These included James, Andrew, Philip, blah, blah, and Judas Iscariot, who handed him over. So like even in 3, Mark's like
Foretelling.
foretelling.
Yeah.
And so it sounds like Judas was a group following Jesus, And at this point, Jesus had singled out Peter, Andrew, Mark,
Yeah.
or Matthew. Y'all are good. And then there's a whole bunch of hangers on. And then he's like, okay, eeny, meeny, miny, moe.
Yeah.
Picks the other 9 to fill them out. But Mark in his telling is already alluding to
Yeah.
pay attention to this guy.
And plus he was named last, which means you're the last one
Probably.
to sign on.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So join early.
Yeah, get in early.
Become part of the. Yeah.
Then we have the institution of the Lord's Supper, right?
Mhm.
And it's normal. We hear it every Sunday. It's the same thing. Who's still at the table?
Everyone but Judas.
No, Judas is still there.
Mhm.
Yeah. That's the thing, right? We don't get the foot washing in here, but we'll have to pay attention to that too. Judas, I believe, is still there for the foot washing. So like Jesus knows all of this and he still gives communion to the guy who's going to turn him over. He still kneels down and washes the feet of the guy who's going to turn him over. It is interesting that Mark, the original one, doesn't include the foot washing, but that seems like a big thing.
Mhm.
We can talk about that when we come to it
Mhm.
in Matthew and Luke.
Yeah, especially since that in this book we were reading, the head of the head of God is in heaven and the feet of God are resting on the earth. So the feet has a real significance, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's
Yeah,
kinda
it does. And there's, it was very symbolic, both for teachers, rabbis. There's this idea for disciples, people that stood at the feet is what a disciple is of these rabbis, rabbinical teachers. There's this idea that they wanted to be covered in the dust of their rabbi, that they wanted to be so close that the dust they kicked up. And there's also symbology for, it's like us taking off our shoes when we go into a house, right? Our feet are probably, our socks are probably dirty too, but like we symbolically do. Some cultures really symbolically do it. And so there's also that part, because even, well, we can talk about that next week, because Peter's like, don't just stop at my feet. And Jesus was like, no, we can get the symbology. But we'll save that for when we get to the foot washing, because Peter has enough problems.
Yes.
Because immediately after we have communion, right, then we jump in. When they had sung the hymn, that's the traditional closing hymn, right? It's that definite article is like, it's talking about a specific song that usually closed the Passover meal. Then they head out. And Jesus said to them, you all fall away, for it is written, I'll strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. But after I'm raised up, I will go before you. Peter said, even though all fall away, I will not. Jesus said to him, truly, I tell you, this day, this very night, before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. But he said vehemently, even though I must die with you, I will not deny you. And all of them said the same. So Peter here is still hard-headed. Right? We've had that a lot in the gospel, where Peter thinks he has it all figured out. What else in there? Then we get to Jesus praying in Gethsemane, the Mount of Olives. And then he said to his disciples, sit here while I pray. He took with him Peter, James, and John and began to be distressed and agitated. He said to them, my soul is deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and keep awake. Going a little farther, he threw himself on the ground and prayed, said, Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. Remove this cup from me. What's Jesus doing there, do you think?
Testing them if they'll stay awake
Well,
a little bit.
maybe, but I mean, in that specific prayer, right?
He's
Oh,
asking to just,
Get out of it.
Yeah, I mean, he's hopeful.
Yeah, I mean, we talked
to do this.
Yeah, like we think Jesus is, God's son. Obviously, he's some superhero.
Yeah.
Like Jesus is like begging to not have to do this.
Hmm.
And so that's, Jesus knew what he was getting into the whole time. But even that, like for me, like this line more than anything in the Bible is the humanity of Jesus, right?
Mm.
He knows what has to happen. He knows he's the guy. He knows he's God's son. He's like, if there's any other way, can this happen? Probably because, right? He just said, Peter, you're my best friend and you're going to deny me. Judas, this guy whose feet I just washed, you're going to turn me in.
Yeah.
You three that I just said stay away. Like, he's probably frustrated as much as anything. It's like everyone's starting to abandon him. He sees it all coming. And so it seems natural.
It's human. Yeah.
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 Yeah, that makes total sense.
What else as we read this? Because then there's multiple times where the disciples fall asleep. Jesus comes to him and says, could you not stay awake? Do all of that. What else can we learn from that when we hear those or when we think about that?
Well, it's interesting that even though the direction is very explicit right in front of you, they can't live up to it.
Yeah, we're human. We're all human. They're human too. They're really tired. They've been up with Jesus for, on the whole thing. And
And they were now drinking and eating.
Yeah, true. They just finished a feast.
Yeah.
yeah, with probably a little wine there.
Yeah. But like if they knew this was the last day they would see with Jesus,
They may do something different.
maybe.
Like sometimes, the small things are hard to do.
Yeah.
Maybe they just also
First step to
denied
do
it.
something.
They denied it in their, oh no, this isn't going to happen. This is just another night. Or at least they're trying to convince themselves that it's just another night.
Yeah.
Also,
I mean, they've done that. That Jesus had to remind them several times, hey, I'm going to die. It's
Yeah.
coming. And they're like, yeah, okay, whatever you say, Jesus.
yeah. Basically words are cheap.
Yeah.
Deeds, not words.
Yeah, I'm up with it. And its actions can speak louder there.
Then we get into, we're still in the garden. This is verse 43, the betrayal and the arrest of Jesus. Immediately while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived with him. There was a crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and scribes. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, now we're not even calling him Judas. Now we're calling him the betrayer, right? So Mark's already turned on this dude. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, the one I kiss will be the man. Arrest him, lead him away. So when he came, he went up to it once and said, Rabbi, and kissed him. Then they laid hands on him and arrested him. Note there that, like, even as Judas is turning him over, he still calls him Rabbi.
Mm-hmm.
So is that sincere? Is that Judas trying to make himself feel better?
And plus a form of affection,
Maybe.
as to point out that a kiss, you go, well, it's him. To me, that would be
Well,
more
it's-
appropriate.
And if it's in the group,
Yeah.
if he was in the group, they might not know that what he's doing at that moment.
Yeah,
So
that's
if he plays along like that, it's just,
Our secret son, that's true.
yeah.
And then it goes on, 47. But one of those who stood near drew his sword and struck the slave of the high priest, cutting off his ear.
Hmm.
That disciple's not named. We know from the other gospels who it is. It's Peter. But it's interesting that Mark doesn't name him. And so that leads to the way the gospels are constructed. Maybe Matthew and Luke interviewed or talked to other people that remembered differently. Maybe, I forget which one of those, we'll have to look and see, names Peter. All throughout the gospels, they've held up Peter as kind of this head of the church once Jesus is gone, right? That becomes clear once the keys to the kingdom kind of stuff. And so Peter's always, he's the first one out of the boat, right? To walk on water. He's the first one to do all these things. And so maybe it actually wasn't Peter that cut off the ear, but as the tradition develops in the first decades after, they're like, we're going to make it Peter. because it fits the narrative. We don't know. But the earliest manuscripts don't name the disciple. It's later, after the tradition is more fully developed, that he gets named.
Can I ask a question based on my ignorance here? And is where Judas comes in at this last, where they name and Judas at the end as his last disciple, is that the first you hear of him, or has he been involved earlier?
Well, that was back in Mark 3. That's where he first came in. So in Mark 3, the first disciples that were named were Simon and his brother, and then Levi, Matthew, and then at least in Mark. And then a little bit later, it talks about Judas being among those picked from the disciples. So It sounds like there's a huge crowd
and he's
following Jesus around. And so Judas had been following him around probably from pretty early on. And then he's finally picked out.
Huh.
One of the craziest verses in Scripture is Mark 14:51. A certain young man was following him, wearing nothing but a linen cloth.
Yeah.
They caught hold of him, but he left the linen cloth and ran off naked. What's that about? I don't know. In the middle of the Passion narrative, we have a streaker.
I wonder where they started.
Right, that's what
I
it
thought
is.
it was at Florida State.
No, they were reading their Bible the night before, and he's like, if that dude can do it, I can do it.
I'm always amazed at these strange things that weren't edited out.
Yeah, right? Like this is, and this is something like, if you're doing a movie and this happens at the beginning, it has to be explained.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's just dumb. This is never explained. So it's just wild. Maybe it's just to break the tension. Here,
Like
my
what
note
you've
here
said
says-
before, you can overdo the analysis,
Exactly.
You'd overdo it.
My note in my Bible says various interpretations have been proposed for this mysterious incident, including allusions to the young man in the linen cloth in 1546 and naked flight in Genesis 39:12. The context suggests a contrast between Jesus's calm courage and a follower's desperate flight. So the idea maybe is this is just another follower who's freaking out, like all of them probably are, and Jesus continuing to just go along with him. So then, Jesus is arrested, 53. They took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests and elders and the scribes were assembled. Here is a religious trial still, right? The high priest. So this is still a canon law issue.
And people who came for it were not soldiers.
They were the disciples of the high priest working.
This Mark says it was a crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. This isn't like a Roman legion, at least in Mark's telling. We'll have to pay attention to the others. This is the Swiss Guard, right? Not that the Swiss Guard was there, but a similar thing. Maybe the Diocese of Texas needs a militia, so we can go out and arrest people. So this is all still a religious matter right now. So they took him there. Now the chief priests and the whole council were looking for testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. For many gave false testimony against him, and their testimony did not agree. So it's almost like they're trying to lead some witnesses, maybe. They're like, Bob, you saw this dude do something, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you tell me one thing, you're like, Jim, you saw. Why can't you get your story straight, guys? Like they're trying to pin it on this guy, and they can't.
But why are they even pretending to do this? I mean,
What do you think?
They wanted to give validity to their actions.
I think it's to preserve their credibility after the action, to say, we did it, we had a reason.
We went through exhaustive questioning
Right.
of all the eyewitnesses.
Yeah.
We've come to this definitive conclusion.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, we were asking like why they even bothered to try to get evidence. Yeah, it's a sham trial.
It's a sham trial, so why waste the time?
Um, some stood up, or it says, we heard him say, I will destroy the temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days build another not made with hands. But even on this point, their testimony didn't agree.
Hmm.
There, if you remember, Jesus was alluding not to the temple destruction, but to him dying.
Yes.
The temple is destroyed later, and so there's some scholarly debate about the gospel writers who witnessed, maybe not Mark, Matthew's a lot more about the temple. After the temple was destroyed in 70 something, I forget. But the gospel writers wrote back in more about Jesus talking about the temple being destroyed, because that would have been a trigger for people to listen to. But here, Mark alludes to it, but not everyone agreed on that even. And so then they finally talked to Jesus. They stood up to him and said, have you no answer? What is it that they testify against you? But he was silent and did not answer. Again, the high priest asked him, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? And Jesus said, I am. What's he saying there? He's God. Yeah. So that's back to the Genesis thing. He's not just saying, yes, I'm agreeing with you that I'm the person. He's using the name for God. Right. We'll hear that this Sunday in the gospel reading. Right. This Sunday's gospel reading is Jesus and the Samaritan woman at the well. And the Samaritan woman is like, I know there's supposed to be a Messiah coming someday. You're just a dude handing me some water. Mm-hmm. And Jesus, our translation, I think, says, I am he. That's not what he says. He says, I am. Like he's telling this woman, not, yeah, I'm the guy. He's saying, specifically, I am God. Yeah. And so we hear that when Jesus uses the I am statements, right? Those will come up in John when, like Jesus isn't saying, yes, I am that person. His I am statements are God and these other things. The I am is like the key part of that. And so here, so Jesus said, I am, and then he quotes some scripture. You will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power, coming with the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, why do we still need witnesses? You have heard his blasphemy. The blasphemy wasn't in Jesus agreeing that he was the Messiah. The blasphemy was Jesus saying, I am
God.
Yeah.
And that was really the crux of what they, quote, convicted him of, right?
Yeah, absolutely. All of them condemned them, it says in 64, and as deserving death. Some began to spit on him, to blindfold him, to strike him, saying to him, prophesy. The guards also took him and beat him. And so this is all the crowds are starting to turn on him.
And these are not the Roman guards.
No.
Well, we don't know that they
No,
are,
but-
because the only people so far doing any of this
Are the
religious
scribes, yeah.
Yeah.
They'll get their turn.
Oh, pretty soon.
They're not innocent.
Pretty soon.
When he said prophesy, doesn't that mean, well, this is the prophecy, which would be, he is the Son of God? Or, I mean, what is that? I mean, it seems like that they would say, not the prophecy or something. You know what I mean?
But
Yeah.
it wasn't him saying prophesy. That
It was-
was them saying
Yeah.
prophesy.
Yeah, but to
See,
me, that's
Jesus
saying,
for him to prophesy.
they're criticizing him for prophesying.
Yeah, I think they're taunting him.
Yeah.
Okay.
If you say this,
Your
then
God shows up, you
prophesy.
prophesy.
Yeah.
Because it seemed to me like they're saying, this is prophecy. Well, that
No,
would
they're like
legitimize.
commanding him to, putting God to the test.
Okay.
And the answer is, well, that's what
And
I'm
he
doing
doesn't
now.
speak. Yeah,
Exactly.
he doesn't give anything in his defense to he gives.
No.
Yeah. Okay.
Until next year.
Yeah.
And this is gonna happen, but I need to be alive until then.
And then we jump to Peter in the courtyard. Female servant sees Peter and says, you are also with him. Peter denied it, saying, I don't know or understand what you're talking about. Then he went out and the cock crowed. The female servant, on seeing him again, began to say to bystanders, this man's one of them. But again, he denied it. Then a little while, the bystander again said to Peter, "Certainly you're one of them, for you're a Galilean, and you talk like one." But he began to curse and swore an oath, "I do not know this man you are talking about." At that moment, the cock crowed for the second time. Then Peter remembered that Jesus had said to him, "But the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." And he broke down and wept. Right after they told Jesus to prophesy, something that Jesus prophesied came true.
Okay.
Not
Yeah.
maybe not connected, but we read it like in the living.
Yeah.
It maybe wasn't connected, but Mark wants us to know Jesus actually did prophesy some things.
Yeah.
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 So then,
Without him having
Peter's-
to tell the crowd something that he had prophesied came true. It's almost like,
Yep.
yeah.
Yeah. And so Peter knew it, and he broke down and wept. And then Jesus spends night in a dungeon or in a basement. If you go there now, it's kind of down in a well in the basement of a building, whether or not that was the actual place. But then it was morning. The chief priests held a consultation with the elders. They bound Jesus, led him away to be handed over to Pilate. Pilate asked him, "Jesus, are you the king of the Jews?" He answered, "You say so." Then the chief priests accused him of many things. Pilate again asked him, "Have you no answer? See how many charges they bring against you?" But Jesus made no further reply, so that Pilate was amazed. And it goes on, now at the festival, he used to release a prisoner for them, anyone for whom they asked. Now a man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder during the insurrection. So that's maybe another reason why they wanted to keep it quiet during the festival, is because obviously there was an insurrection that had just been fomented and people were killed. And so they're probably a little gun shy. And the chief priests are like, remember, Barabbas did that. We don't want Jesus and his disciples to start killing people. So this guy, at least Mark tells us, is an insurrectionist who committed murder. So the crowd came and began to ask to do according to his custom. Then Pilate answered the crowd, "Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" For he realized that it was out of jealousy that the chief priest had handed him over. So here, Pilate's like not bought into Jesus's guilt of anything.
No.
You know, he's maybe wants to make this problem go away because he's like a backwater ruler, you know, like he's a long way from Rome. And he doesn't want to cause problems because when there's problems, Rome will hear about it. And that makes problems for him.
I was saying this is not one of the prime positions to have in the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
In Palestine.
Yeah. And it's kind of like, if the diocese knows what we're doing here at St. Martin's, like, it's maybe not a good thing, right? You know, they know the good things we're doing. But if they're like really involved, if Rome's like really involved down here, it's because things have gone awry.
Yeah.
Right?
Too much adult supervision.
Too much adult supervision is not a good thing. And so Pilate's like, man,
I've always practiced that.
let's just like make these problems go away. And I don't care if Jesus is guilty or not. I just don't want this crowd to start killing people. And so he spoke to them again. "What do you wish me to do with the man you call King of the Jews?" They shouted back, "Crucify him." Now this crowd is the same one that not too many chapters before was welcoming Jesus in, saying, "Hosanna in the highest. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." And this on Palm Sunday, right? We start out there in the labyrinth, and we all do that. And then we go in, and when the gospel's read, we all yell out, "Crucify him." It's the same people. So a lot can happen in 5 days.
Mhm.
And that's one of the things, I mean, so much has happened in the Passion narrative. Palm Sunday is a perfect example because it's almost a feast day celebration outside. Palm Sunday is this joyous thing. But then we come in, and the gospel we read inside is the Passion, right? So it's this very kind of bipolar Sunday that sometimes hard to wrestle with. But like we're the same people that like welcome in Jesus and then also want him dead. Pilate still isn't convinced. Verse 14. "Why? What evil has he done?" he asked. But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, not wishing to see justice done, not wishing to do the right thing, but like get the crowd to stop complaining, he handed Barabbas, the killer, to them. And after flogging Jesus, handed him over to be crucified.
Can I ask you, was that the way they always did things? Did they always crucify? And when the Jewish people said we want somebody killed, executed, was it always the Romans that did the executions?
Yeah, I would imagine so.
It wouldn't have been the.
I think the Jewish tradition was stoning.
Yeah.
Right,
Jews were,
probably, but I'm just asking. The Europeans had a long time to rewrite, to cover themselves. And say, blame it on them. Let's blame it on them. Let's not take,
Yeah.
let's not blame it on that it's both of us. We were all, and I don't know.
yeah. And so
Scapegoat.
I was just wondering how that, like, for so long the Jews were persecuted because of what happened. But should we have persecuted Europeans also? Should Europeans also have felt guilt?
Yeah.
For what?
Yeah, and in particular, when we get to Matthew, we'll pay attention to how many times Matthew says the Jews. The Jews did this, the Jews did that. I mean, Matthew in particular, anti-Semites have used that gospel for a lot of bad things. Well, you killed Jesus, so I can send you to the gas chambers, right? That kind of thing. So Matthew didn't probably mean that because Matthew himself was a Jew. I think Matthew meant, guys, we did this.
Yes.
We did this. But then, a couple hundred years later, or 1900 years later, it's no longer we, it's
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
Jews,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so that's a misreading, I think. It left in there probably because the earliest Jews wanted to remember, man, we really screwed up. Not understanding that people would come by 1,000 years later, 1,600 years later, 1,900 years later, 2,000 years later, right?
Yeah.
And completely misread that. The other thing about the Romans, it probably, if I were to guess, we maybe downplayed in the Gospels the role of the Romans because we didn't want to be killed by the Romans, right?
Oh, I see.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, so one part of it is us saying we're the Jews and we did this, and we want to remember that we did this. But also, right, like we don't want to say anything extra bad about Rome because they're actively killing us. And when all the Gospels were written, Jews were actively being hunted by Romans, followers of Jesus in particular.
Was Mark liked by the scribes and the elders for what he wrote here?
Probably not. I mean, none of the early followers of Jesus were liked by, because the scribes and the elders sent Paul out to find these people.
Not that I'm some expert, but we're just reading Richard Rohr, and he says the exact same thing that you're saying. That he says that one of the most amazing things about the scapegoating, that the Jewish people did it to themselves by naming it this way, by admitting that their own people. It was a unique position for a scapegoat that they would admit. It wasn't an outsider, it was them themselves. It's exactly what you're saying.
Yeah, because we read this as we're Christians 2,000 years later, and when we see words like the Jews, but when these folks are writing that, they're not talking about someone else.
Right. And that's a unique place. It's actually very humbling. It's very spiritual, right? Because they're willing to admit,
Yeah, a fearless moral inventory, right?
Yeah, exactly.
To use the terms.
Yeah.
And years later, it gets misinterpreted.
Yeah, they're like, we did it, guys. We really screwed up because that sets up, right, the rest of it, because they know when they're writing this down, our biggest screw up is not the end of the story, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Right. It'd be different if they ended it with Jesus being dead. They're like, we screwed up. But they're able to leave that in there because they know it's not the end of the story. And so we know that our worst mistakes are not the end of the story.
But if they didn't do what they did, we wouldn't really have a resurrection.
Yeah, that's an interesting question that's long been debated. Like, did Judas have to do what Judas did?
Yes.
Did all these? I think God could have figured it out some other way. Because like if Judas and the disciples were there, I would figure out Jesus.
Yeah.
If somebody would.
Yeah.
So Pilate, he's handed over to be crucified. The soldiers mock Jesus. Hail, King of the Jews. They're really playing up this King of the Jews thing. They're like playing to the crowd, it almost seems. They struck his head, spat on him, mocking him. Mark doesn't allude to the prophecies that as much. The other gospels will. All of these things, the mocking, the spitting, all of that. It is, other gospels tell us, fulfillment of prophecies. And then we get in 21, the crucifixion. They compelled a passerby who was coming in from the country to carry his cross. We talked about this on Sunday. It was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. What do we learn in that little passage? Who does Mark name?
And outside of somebody not
He started as an outsider, but who else does he name?
I'm not sure who
Alexander and Rufus, it's his kids.
Yes.
Oh.
So when Mark says that, he's not saying there was this outsider and whatever. He's basically saying he's an outsider, and y'all know Alex and Rufus because they're no longer outsiders. So the tradition around this is that Simon of Cyrene carried the cross as an outsider, and in that moment his life was changed. He became a follower of Jesus, and now his kids are so well known that Mark can just refer to him and everyone knows who he's talking about.
Are they mentioned previously?
Mm-hmm.
And
And so this, like, including those random names, right? Like Simon is the one who did the thing. No reason Mark would have named Alexander and Rufus except to be like, Jim, if you don't believe me, go talk to those kids down the street.
or it's that naked kid who
Maybe one of those was Alexander. But it's the idea that, like, even on his way to the cross, Jesus finds a way to make an outsider a part of the movement. So much so that, like, the family is transformed.
And from what I understand, it was a really far outsider. Cyrene was not close to Jerusalem.
Then they brought him to the place called Golgotha, place of the skull. They offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. Crucified him, divided his clothes among them, casting lots. Again, Mark gives us the details. Matthew and Luke will fill in the prophecy does fill. Mark's not concerned with, like, lining out all the prophecies that Jesus is fulfilling, although casting lots among the clothing is one of those. It was 9:00 in the morning. The inscription charged against him read, "The King of the Jews." They crucified 2 rebels, one on his right, one on his left. Those who passed by derided, shaking their heads, saying, "You would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days. Save yourself, come down." In the same way, the chief priests and the scribes were mocking him. He saved others, he cannot save himself. Those are the same things that Satan said to Jesus in the wilderness. If you're the Son of God, you can do these things. Right? And so I mentioned this in my sermon a couple weeks ago. That same temptation didn't end in the wilderness. It came back on the cross. If you're the Son of God, you can do this. And Jesus, by staying on the cross, said, don't put the Lord your God to the test. Then when it was noon, so Jesus was hanging up there 3 hours, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. At 3:00, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This is the only thing Jesus says from the cross in Mark. We have 7 last words of Jesus that are all pulled from different places. When one of the bystanders heard this, they were confused. They thought he said he's calling for Elijah. And someone ran, filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a stick, and gave it to him to drink, saying, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down." Then Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last. And the curtain of the temple was torn in 2 from top to bottom. Now the centurion who stood facing him saw that this way he had breathed his last, he said, "Truly this man was God's son." There were also women looking on from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the younger, and of Joseph, Salome, who followed him. He was in Galilee and ministered to them. There were many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem. So in that passage, we hear a couple things. One, the first person to recognize Jesus as God's son after his death was a soldier.
Yeah.
Well, Roman.
A Roman, yeah.
Mhm.
The people that were killing him saw something in it. Before he ever raised from the dead, I mean, this guy's still dead, and he killed him. And somehow this guy's like, wait a minute.
Something's wrong here.
Yeah. And we also learned that maybe the only people at the cross were women. Another gospel will tell us John's also there because Jesus has this interaction between Mary and John. So maybe there's others.
Yeah,
But in Mark's recollection.
Yeah, this way. My
Yeah.
son.
So we'll get to that later. But here, the women are the one who stayed.
The torn curtain, what does that signify?
What do you think signifies?
Well,
Mark doesn't close that circle.
Well, the
yeah, I,
curtain was to separate I think in the temple, the curtain separated the holy part from where the people are.
Mm.
so, yeah, because I kind of Googled it and it says that it was transparent now.
Right.
And so so there was a curtain between the holy part of the temple versus the unholy
It
part.
exposed to the people.
Everything.
Right.
Okay.
And is that- Wow.
So some people say it might allude to, again, if this is written like that, when people know the temple's destroyed, literally, this is an allusion to that. But the one I've always heard, like a devotional understanding of this, is that the thing that separates us from the presence of God, which is the Holy of Holies, is gone. Which direction does it tear from?
Top to the bottom.
Yeah.
It's not us from the bottom doing it from the top.
So God's saying, this is all open to you.
Yeah, Mark doesn't tell us, right?
No.
That's 2,000 years of devotional reading. And like we make meaning out of everything.
Yeah.
Maybe it just tore, but like I think it does say something.
I like this meaning, by the way.
Yeah. Yeah.
I want to believe it.
No, I mean, that's a very helpful thing for me.
It's an interesting contradiction
Yes.
to the way the Catholic Church developed, where rather than you having a direct relationship with God, they put all these interceding people in between you and God.
Mhm.
So it's like they're kind of reconstructing that.
They're there just to help you, Bob.
Yeah. No, I mean, we want to stitch that curtain back up all the time.
No, all the time.
We all do. We all want to put something between us and God. You know, we have to do things the right way, or we have to say the right words. We have to do whatever. But we have very plainly here, not even being a Roman who killed him was able to separate
Yes.
the centurion from God. Right?
So does that mean it's
Maybe
written
you don't have
forever?
any of this stuff.
That it's always, that we're opened? That it's
Say that
open
again?
forever? That once the curtain's ripped, it's open for all time? I mean, in other words, that means we have access to God from now on. Do you think it's like, I mean, is it something?
Yeah, I mean, that's the devotional reading of this. We're not told, at least in Mark, we're not told that the chief priest went and stitched the thing back together. They may be
Right,
witness. But the devotional reading of this is that it happened and it's open forever. Mark
And it's
doesn't
open,
close
yeah.
the curtain back up for us.
Hmm.
Yeah. Then we have Jesus buried. Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member, came. And he took the body. When he had learned that he was dead, he brought a linen cloth, taking down the body, wrapped it, and then rolled a stone against the door of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where the body was laid. Then when Sabbath was over, so Easter morning, Mary and Salome brought spices so they might go and anoint him, because he was supposed to be anointed when he was buried, but he's buried on the Sabbath, so they can't work. So they have to come back the next day and do that. Very early the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They'd been saying to one another, "Who will roll the stone away?" It's a very good hymn. Roll the stone away. When they looked up, they saw the stone had already been rolled back. They entered the tomb. They saw a young man dressed in a white robe, sitting on the right side. They were alarmed. But he said, don't be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth who was crucified. He's been raised. He's not here. Look, there's the place they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter he's going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. That's the end of the story. The earliest manuscripts we have of Mark don't have anything after that. So the part that was written in the 60s ends with the Marys not saying anything to anyone. We know the story today, so we can be pretty assured that they finally told somebody. But the original ending of Mark, none of the rest of it happens. We have 2 alternate endings. These are like the bonus cuts, right? Well, if you stay to the end of the movie, you can see, or you get the director's cut. We get those. But the original, the most ancient sources ends at 1618.
So
And then there's others. The original sources end there, and then the later sources from like the first couple hundred years, some of them include one of the next part, and the others include the others. It's not until pretty later that we put both of the endings in. And so my Bible calls the next bit the intermediate ending of Mark. All that it commanded them, they told briefly to those around Peter. It goes on because we do know someone found out about it. So we can't end the story with them being quiet. And so the intermediate ending is one verse. It says, all they've been commanded them, they told briefly to Peter. This downplays the role of the women, right? Because then it becomes Peter who tells everyone. And afterward, Jesus himself sent out through them from east to west the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation. Amen. Is what my Bible says.
Well, who's the young man dressed in the white robe? He could have told him, unless it was Jesus himself, basically in another garb or another. You know what I mean? I mean, if they leave it at the end like that, it ends up being more about faith.
Yeah, it leaves it more open. Yeah, and so that first ending, the one sentence ending, that was we haven't found anything earlier than the 4th century.
Huh.
That's that. So that's 400 years. The long ending, we have sources from the 2nd century, but nothing earlier than that. So for at least probably 100 years, all we knew was that Mary told nobody. We put the order differently because we had this one little sentence, but that's like the last thing written in Mark, which this gets confusing. I told you before, like I have multiple books that try to explain the debates because we don't have Mark. Like you couldn't go to Barnes & Noble and buy the Gospel of Mark. We would have like a couple pieces of scratch paper from your house. We'd have a couple people of scratch paper, and we have like a corrupted file on your computer that we can kind of get some of it from. So we're going to take all these things, we're going to put it down, and we're going to like try to put it together.
So Mark is saying there's no resurrection.
Well, no, because he's not in the tomb, but there's no resurrection appearances.
Yes.
So
and
we don't
nobody
know.
ever tries to identify this young man in the white robe. They don't even, he's never heard from her.
It's an angel is kind of the traditional reading of that.
Okay.
But yeah, so there's a resurrection, but for Mark's original stuff,
Nobody knows about it.
he doesn't say anything about it.
Mary knows about it. A couple people do, but it's not.
Yeah. But like, obviously, like people found out about it. And so this isn't like some Luke and Matthew come in and start making stuff up, because Paul, who's writing before Luke and Matthew, alludes to the resurrection of Jesus. He alludes to people who saw Jesus resurrected. He himself says he had a vision of Jesus. So like the earliest church understood that Jesus like got up and walked around. It's just the gospel doesn't have it until like 200 years later.
But
And that's this gospel.
That's this gospel.
It's this.
Matthew and Luke not, because they're written 90-ish. So they're written before Mark's thing. So maybe the people who found and added the Mark thing took some back from Matthew and Luke. But the original, like the earliest things we have that tell the story of Jesus is Mark before these alternate endings. But this isn't some conspiracy, right? Because this is something that would end up on the Discovery Channel and they'd be like, oh, Mark made it up or Matthew made it up. No, because Paul, who's writing pretty close to the time that Mark is, talks about these things. So obviously someone told someone, people saw Jesus, right?
I wonder why Mark didn't say anything. I mean, did anybody ever, I mean, does Mark kind of peter out, so to speak?
No, I mean, Mark becomes traditionally, we don't all actually know who Mark is, but traditionally Mark becomes a companion to Peter.
Okay.
Whether that's true or not, because there were lots of people named Mark, and sometimes people were just given like fake names because it was maybe some scribe who wrote this down, and he wasn't having an actual name. But traditionally, it's Mark the evangelist who knew Peter eventually. Sorry, not Peter. Paul. So that gets us to that. The rest of it, we can talk more about the appearances, the ascension. Mark gives very little attention. Even in the part they add to Mark later, there's very little given.
Yes.
So how does your provocative question about whether 16 should have ever been included?
Well, it's that. It's the original gospel we have doesn't have Jesus like walking around talking to people.
So does that refer to just this last very?
That's basically, so verse 8 is where it ended.
Right. So
that, and
it's the rest of this.
it's the rest of
Should
this.
that have been included?
Yeah.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. And so this gets into, I mean, yes, it should have been included because from 100 years later, and like that's the way like all literature was back then. There's not an original copy of Julius Caesar floating around out there, right? Like none of this. We have like all these things and we piece them together and we make our best guess of what was written. The Iliad, the Odyssey, pick, name it. We don't have like pull it off a shelf. The Bible's no different. People want to make the Bible different because we think it's something different. So if there's bits and pieces, then how can that be God's word? Well, because God's word was written on something that fell apart after a couple decades.
It's complicated.
Right. And so we do our best to reconstruct it. And the fact, like this, I'm making too big of a claim here. The fact that we don't have the original endings, something being within 100 years of it, historically, that it's an original ending. Like, this is all part of Mark. I'm not willing to kick it out of the Bible. But it is interesting how we could see the people developing it wrote back into Mark what they learned from Luke and Matthew.
Excuse me.
Yeah, it's good to see you.
Are we at any point going to dig into the relationship between Peter and Paul?
We can. Yeah. So Peter,
That to me has always been an enigma. Here you've got these, 12 dudes who's followed him around, who've learned from him. And now here's this stranger who falls off a horse or donkey or something and becomes so enlightened that now almost the rest of the New Testament
all of it
is sourced to him.
Yeah. So we could
I
do,
don't get that.
and maybe the next thing we do after the resurrection stuff is we look at Acts, because during Eastertide, we read from the gospel or from the book of Acts. And that's where we see all of this, like Peter and Paul getting in fights and like causing everyone to like leave their missionary journeys and come back to solve these problems because Peter and Paul can't get it together. And they're kind of like a buddy comedy, a little bit, where they're rivals. Maybe it's an interesting thing because both of them are hard-headed,
Right.
in different ways. But yeah. So that would be interesting. It comes up a lot in the book of Acts. And so maybe once we get past Easter, that can be what we start to look at.
And I'm sorry if I'm the only one, but it's just a big hole in my knowledge of the ancient church as to how did that interplay happen and how did Paul then become, I guess, the new anointed one?
Well, yeah, so some of that,
Issue all this
and
knowledge.
we can get into that. Some of that is because he was a Roman and he was the one who could freely travel. Peter had to be careful.
Mhm.
No one was Peter got crucified.
Yeah.
Well,
No
didn't
one's
John do a lot too? John traveled a lot.
He did. He also got exiled and ultimately
Yeah, and he
killed
got
as
killed.
well.
Yeah.
And Paul got killed too, but Paul had more freedom to move around. It wasn't until the very end that people started to get mad at him. But him being a well-regarded Jew and also a Roman, gave him a freedom and a credibility that like poor fishermen didn't maybe have.
Hmm.
Right. If you think about a movement that starts with like day laborers, and then like you get some high-powered lawyer who's like, yeah, these dudes are on it. Who's the world going to then start to listen to?
That probably.
Right.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. We're over time. Thank you. We'll look at Matthew next time.
Yeah. So Peter died before Paul.
I don't remember. That'd be an interesting timeline to look at.
Yeah, because I was thinking how much did they overlap versus not overlap.
Yeah. I mean, they had considerable because overlap because a lot of the controversies that they're coming down and they're fighting over whether people need to be circumcised,
Yes.
things like that. So there's at least enough overlap for them to start to develop their own customs and their own churches that they've helped start.
And you wonder, was Paul a student of the disciples, or was his gaining knowledge independent of the disciples?
Yeah. I mean, the way he writes, like he's at least read the Gospels,
Yes.
but he probably talked to people firsthand. And he'll, because he talks about, Jesus appearing to the witnesses. The words of institution, Paul has them in his letters, right? Just like Mark does. He talks about when Jesus did this thing. So he obviously either read it in Mark or talked to somebody about it.
That's good.
Cool. Thank you, Judy.
Thank you.
We'll be
Thank
back
you
next
for
week.
letting me come here. This is
Of course.
I love all of this. So applies to everything that we're doing on the Thursday group too.
Yeah. It's good to
Thanks.
see you.
Bye.